Now, for one, quorum is present. National Review Board, comment order. Ms. Seymour, please call the roll.
Stephanie Leiby, Keith Brainerd,
Here.
Marcia Dush,
Here.
Chris Gonzalez,
Here.
Robert Reese,
Here.
Christopher Zook.
Here.
I think there's going to be more than like probably the equivalent.
Good morning. A quorum is present.
I'm sorry.
Ivy may be joining us later with business that she's attending to. And first on next item on the agenda is the consideration of the minutes. And I would entertain a motion to suspend reading of the minutes of the last meeting. So moved. Moved by Mr. Reese. Is there a second?
Second.
Second, was that Mr. Gonzalez?
Yes.
Morning, thank you. Motion has been made by Mr. Reese, seconded by Mr. Gonzalez. Is there any discussion on the minutes? Motion is to suspend the reading of the minutes. All in favor, please say aye.
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 Opposed, say nay. Ayes have it. Minutes will not be read or approved as distributed. We have an agenda item pertaining to excusing the absence of a board member from the June 29th board meeting, and I'd like to ask Ms. Dush to make that motion, please.
I will entertain a motion to excuse Keith Brainerd from the June 29th, 2023 board meeting.
I make the motion, Christopher Zook.
That move. Go ahead, Marcia, please.
I did not hear who seconded.
Mr. Reese.
Thank you. A motion has been made by Mr. Zook and seconded by Mr. Reese. Is there any discussion from the board? Hearing none. All in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? The ayes have it. Mr. Brainerd's absence from the June 29th, 2023 board meeting is excused.
Thank you, Marcia. Thank you, members. We'll do it again. Next item on the agenda is an item for public comments. You have 3 minutes to address the board. Is there anyone here in person or online who would like to address the board? Now is your opportunity. Please come forward. Hearing no one, seeing no one, I would just like to ask if anyone is here from a public retirement system in Texas that is not on the agenda item today, would you please let us know you're here?
Good morning. I'm Linda Webb. I am the new executive director of the Fort Worth Employees Retirement Fund, and I'm listening in today for the first time. So I just wanted to say good morning, and I am here representing the fund and listening this morning.
Good morning, Ms. Webb. Back from California.
That's right.
We're glad you're here.
Thank you.
Anyone else from a retirement system in Texas who's not on the agenda? Yes, sir. Where are you all from? Odessa. Odessa. You drove in from Odessa? Actually flew it. We usually drive. Thanks very much. We appreciate all that Odessa, the fire plan, and the city are doing for your plan. Thanks, and we appreciate you coming out. Anyone else? Yes, where are y'all from? Beaumont Fire. Beaumont Fire. Thanks very much. We appreciate you being here also. Thank you. Oh, I'm so sorry.
Free elected official from the city of Dallas.
Good morning. Thanks for coming down. We're glad you're here. Okay, next item on the agenda is the intensive review of the Abilene Firemen's Relief and Retirement Fund. I'd like to call on ask the Pension Review Board staff members, Brian Burnham, David Fee, and Robert Muncher to present this item. And while they're coming up, I'd like to ask Ms. Dush if she has something to preface for the presentation. Marcia?
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to say a couple of words before the staff presents their report on the Abilene Firemen's Relief and Fire Retirement Fund. I thought it might be helpful to remind everyone why we conduct these reviews. Section 801.202 of the Texas Government Code states that one of the general responsibilities of the Texas Pension Review Board is to conduct intensive studies of potential or existing problems that threaten the actuarial soundness of or inhibit an equitable distribution of benefits in one or more public retirement systems. In the case we're about to examine, we have a puzzling situation, in my opinion, a very low funded ratio, which makes us concerned about the actuarial soundness of the plan, but the reported funding period has been at or has remained at or below 30 years, even though the funded ratio has dropped precipitously in recent years. This plan has a two-tiered benefit level with a maximum benefit. It has a high level of employee contributions, which is expected to continue into the future, even though this level of employee contributions exceeds the value of some current and probably all future employees' projected benefits. This gives me a concern about the equitable distribution of benefits. It is important to note that the PRB cannot force benefit or contribution changes to a fund. Our job is to shine a light on this type of situation with our intensive reviews. We hope that the fund and the City of Abilene, along with their advisors, will use this information in the intensive review report to develop a plan that addresses both the actuarial soundness of the fund and an equitable distribution of benefits. The membership of this fund is mature with substantial negative non-investment cash flows, which may limit investment choices in the future. But the very low funded ratio should ignite a sense of urgency. We're lucky, though, that Abilene is a thriving community with growth potential. From my point of view, the decisions required to write the path for this fund won't be easy. The fund and the city may want to take advantage of the voluntary funding soundness restoration plan as a way to work through these issues. And let me make one more comment. I believe in defined benefit retirement plans. I think they're the best way to provide a secure retirement for their members. My goal as a member of the Texas Pension Review Board is to help ensure that the money is there to pay benefits and that contributions are manageable and equitable. I personally want this fund to succeed. And thank you for the opportunity to make these introductory remarks.
Thank you, Ms. Dush. I suspect that all of the board members share your thoughtful remarks. We appreciate that content. And now we have a staff presentation. Good morning, gentlemen. Who goes first? Mr. Burnham.
Good morning, members. My name is Brian Burnham. I am the staff analytical services manager. With me today, I have our staff actuary, David Treat, and our investment analyst, Robert Monger. Together, we are going to be presenting to you the intensive review of the Abilene Firemen's Relief Retirement Fund. Please feel free to stop us at any time during the report if you have any questions. And before we begin, I just wanted to thank the members of the Abilene Firemen's Relief Retirement Fund and the City of Abilene. We worked with them throughout this entire process, and I feel like the process went very smoothly with their feedback. For this presentation, we plan to begin by discussing the reasons that Abilene Fire was selected for intensive review, some of which may be a reminder from my previous report from the June board meeting. We will discuss our key findings, which are listed out on the slide, but in the interest of time, we'll introduce them as we get to them. And finally, then we'll discuss staff recommendations. So I'll begin with saying that Abilene Fire is one of 4 systems we highlighted as potential review candidates. Go to the next slide. We'll show why. So the main key metric that stood out to staff was the system's low funded ratio. The system was below 50% funded and was the 13th lowest funded ratio in the state at the time of selection. But what made this metric more concerning was the amortization period being under 30 years despite the low funded ratio. We wanted to explore further and discover why the system consistently had been showing an amortization period near 30 years, while the funded ratio had continually declined, and to a point where it was one of the lowest in the state. And then that drew our attention to what looked like relatively aggressive assumptions, such as their 7.5% assumed return rate, which only 10 systems in the entire state had one of the higher assumed rate than that. And then firmly placed Abilene Fire in the quartile of the highest assumed rates in the entire state. We knew that review of their assumptions to determine what is and isn't reasonable based on their actual experience is needed. And lastly, what ultimately confirmed Abilene Fire as a system to review, we received a formal request from Texas State Representative Stan Lambert's office asking the board to review the system. This was the first request from a member of the state legislature. Since Abilene was already one of the final systems that we were considering for review, we decided to move forward with them as a selection. And then the 13th lowest funded ratio, despite maintaining a steady funding period near 30 years. This slide shows in more detail the decline in the funded ratio over a little more than the past decade. It's a good visual of why it's important to look at more metrics than just the amortization period when we're determining the funding health of the system. As shown with the orange or / yellow line, the plan managed to maintain a funding period of around 30 years throughout this time period, but the gap between the assets and the liabilities continued to widen. If we go back even further than what the graph shows, the plan was 71% funded in 2001. 20 years later, they are 49%. Next slide. So this graph is important, and I'll get to why later on, but it's good to note for the remainder of this review. But one of the first items to address was what was causing the unfunded liability of the plan to grow. And when looking at the sources of change in the unfunded liability over the last couple of decades, we find that investment returns being lower than the assumed rate of return, and the contributions coming into the plan being less than the normal cost and the interest on the unfunded liability were the major contributors to the rise of the UAL.
Brian.
These sources of change are, I'm sorry.
Brian,
This
this is the first time you've mentioned normal cost, and I think it would be helpful to just explain that normal cost is the estimated value of benefits to be earned within the current year. So it is the ongoing 1 year cost of accruing benefits. And because we'll be talking a lot about normal cost throughout this report.
Thank you. These sources of change are important to keep in mind throughout this presentation, as 13.1 million for contributions is a key factor causing our first two findings that we'll get into, and the 12.2 million in investment returns is a key contributor to the third finding that we'll unveil. Overall, these changes in the UAL show us that the plan is experiencing negative amortization, which is what occurs when the unfunded liability is expected to increase from 1 year to the next instead of decreasing, which is what we hope for. Regarding the contributions into the plan, most recently, based on the data reported in the 2026 evaluation, the plan received around 6.1 million in contributions, but needed 7.6 million in order to cover the normal costs and interest on the unfunded liability. The goal is to decrease the unfunded liability year over year, which then should in turn decrease the fund. And now I will turn the presentation over to David Fee to introduce our first topics.
And David, before you get going, I feel like I'm missing something simple here. Can you help me understand how, given what Brian has laid out to this point, how this plan has kept their amortization period, their funding period level over the course of the last handful of years, given the increasing gap in funding ratio?
So the idea with the amortization period is if you're at 30 this year, The expectation is that next year you'll be at 29, the following year you'll be at 28, 27, and so on. So to the extent the system stays around 30, it's really sort of infinite if you don't think about it, because you're going backwards every year from what the expectation is. So that means something's not being met. Return on assets, available, something's not being met, and it's not moving forward. It's supposed to.
And Brian made this point, I think that's why it's a good thing we're now looking at multiple, at least two different metrics that can trigger a review of the funded ratio and the amortization period, because neither one tells the entire story in a silo.
Right. One point I would make is that for telco systems, for most of our telco systems with their assumptions, you would need to be at an amortization period between 18 and 22 to start seeing that unemployment liability actually be expected. So at 30, it's expected to increase, which eventually actually have to get to that point.
Thank you.
David? Are they using an open amortization?
Yes, they are.
Okay. Can you briefly describe the concept of an open amortization method with a 30-year funding?
Yeah, so there's two types of amortization methods. One is closed, meaning that you're just looking at your current employees. You're not bringing in future hires into consideration. And the other is open group, where you're actually bringing in future new hires into consideration that amortization. It's usually when there's two tiers of benefits. This is what actually like to use the open group amortization so that they can only reflect that the more and more members coming into that lower tier.
Okay, that's open closed group. Is that right? You're referring to?
Yes.
I was thinking they were using an open amortization method in which they're staying at 30 years. Every year they're essentially refinancing their amortization period.
Right. So a closed amortization period would mean that you're targeting 29 the next year, 28 the following year, 27 after. Open group, open amortization would be you're just targeting 30 year after year after year.
They're perpetually at 30.
Right, which is akin to being infinite, because if you're not trying to get down to zero, then you're never going to get.
Thank you. Marcia, did you have a question?
Yeah, I guess I would look at it a little differently. Their contributions are fixed, so they're not determining contributions using either a closed or open amortization period. They're just determining the funding period, based on the current valuation and what the current contribution levels are. But I think what will become clear throughout this report is why the amortization or the funding period remains at about 30. And it really depends on the relationship between the level of benefits, which are, like I had mentioned earlier, there's this two-tiered with benefit cap. So the level of benefits as a percentage of pay are decreasing in the future, but the level of employee contributions, which are very substantial, are assumed to remain constant into the future. And that is really, the mechanism that is driving the calculation of the funding period. So again, that funding period is being determined using an open group. It's taking into account new hires, all current members and hires into the future who are expected to pay, very substantial contributions to this fund.
Thank you for that. Mr. Fee?
So looking at finding one, we're looking at the nature of how unfunded liability has moved over the years. So you can see in the chart that the funding gap between assets and liabilities is around 12 million in 2001. And you can see how the liability moves significantly faster than the assets, to the point where there's a gap of 63 million unfunded liability in 2020. Look at that dotted line, as Brian mentioned, the funded ratio decreases from 71% down to 49%. And on the next slide, I'm finding one. Found that asset support only 75% of the retiree liability. So as a reminder, the actual funding methods are designed to fully fund each member's pension benefit during their work group. So by retirement, all assets necessary to pay that employee's benefits should have been contributed. If a member's benefit is not funded during their career, then someone else is left to pay for their benefit. So looking at this chart on the left-hand side, that orange bar is the assets, and blue bar is the retiree liability. And you'll see that in 2011, although the assets weren't enough to fund the full liability, they were at least enough to more than fund the liability for retirees already paid. And when you get to 2017, you can see that that's flipped, and now the retiree liability is greater than the assets. And by 2021, it's kind of the point where assets are only enough to cover 75% of the liability for retirees currently in payment. This means that there are no assets supporting the liability for current active firefighters. On average, they are expected to retire in the next 13 to 15 years, so it's really a small time frame to fund the benefits. Moving on to finding 2, we're going to discuss on the next few slides city and member contributions. We looked at 2 measures, one regarding the member contributions versus the benefit level, and one looking at the employer contributions. We're looking at the member contributions, we're going to look at the employer normal cost. So if the total normal cost is 17% and the employees are putting in 15%, then we're looking at that spread of 2% to reflect the additional percent of compensation for pension. For the employer contributions, we're going to look at the city pension contributions to the fire pension and the city contributions to Social Security, so that we're able to see an apples to apples comparison between cities who contribute and don't contribute to Social Security. One thing to note is that we define the peers differently between the members and the city. For the members, we looked at cities within 200 miles of Abilene, as those are the cities competing for the same firefighters. For the city, we looked at peers of similar size payrolls. So on this slide, we're looking at the employer normal costs. So you can see that Abilene Fire is below 2%, while all the peers on average are above 4%. So Abilene Fire is getting less than half of what most of the peers are getting. This means that increased member contributions are difficult to implement if your goal is for firefighters to receive a pension worth more than what they contribute. This is especially true for Tier 2 members who contribute the same as Tier 1 but receive less benefits. On the next slide, we look at the city contributions. So you can see that Abilene Fire is among the top 3 contributors. On the far left of the chart is the city of Odessa, which agreed to a high contribution rate to start on the path toward good funding. So with Social Security, they're at around 34%. Then on the far right is actually in great funding shape. And the city maintains high contributions to maintain that high funding position. And they're at around 25% rate. In the middle, we see Abilene Fire. They're the 3rd highest at 21.25%, but although they're the 3rd highest, they have not yet secured that solid funding shape. So the question really is, what does the city of Abilene want to accomplish with their contributions, and are they willing to match somewhere in between what Denver has? Now I'll turn it over to Mr. Hunter for finding.
Robert, before you begin, I just want to make an observation here. You go back to the previous slide. So the city is represented by bars that have orange on the top, or cities whose participants are participating in Social Security. Those that do not have an orange bar are non-Social Security, which means that for career workers, career firefighters in non-orange bar cities, this is their only assured source of income. This is it. Don't have Social Security there. Well, back on. And the city is also paying savings, that's 22% pay, as are the firefighters in cost. Thank you. Mr. Munger.
All right, thank you. Again, my name is Robert Muncher. I'm the investment analyst here at the Texas Pension Review Board. I'll be covering which is regarding our finding for investment fund performance, traveling coupled with their overall unfunded status, as well as being a mature plan, may require a more conservative approach with their investments. So first, as David has mentioned, discussing our review from our findings, the overall concerns that we've seen were from funding level of the plan, And with the amount of assets only available for 75% of the entire, the investments itself aren't necessarily in a position to where they can accept a lot of risk. And what this does is it puts a lot of stress on the system's assets. Now, what we have here for this slide, the graph, is showing just focusing on the long-term 10-year net return to the system, as well as compared to their peers. And what we see over the long term is that the system, as well as other Dover peers, have struggled to meet an investment return that is at 7% or higher. Now, in 2021, that was a very good year for them, and they were able to reach an 8% return. But as with 2022 being a very difficult year, they also saw a lot of volatility in their assets, which brought them down to 6% on that 10-year net. Now, that volatility is something that can get very concerned for the system, especially with the funding level of the system, as well as what's that will be here on the next slides. But overall, we see is that a more conservative asset allocation can help reduce this volatility at slight cost to the returns, and something that should be considered for the system, particularly because of how much this volatility can stress those assets when they're at a lower funded level.
Mr. Munter, may I stop you briefly? I want to be sure that the members who are with us online are hearing everything. Can you all give us a thumbs up? You're hearing the testimony? Okay, we're good. Sorry about that. Thank you very much. Can you, staying with that slide, I want to ask a quick question for my understanding. So the blue shaded area represents the range of returns, investor returns, 10-year average returns over for Telfer plans.
Yes.
And the black line is the Abilene fund. And personally say, I don't, investing is not, the purpose of investing is not to shoot the lights out. It's not a competition. And I'm not suggesting anybody should. However, when a fund is consistently at or near the bottom of the range, there may be an issue.
Yes, there could be an issue. Now, again, this is long term, so a lot of this is still from past, but at the bottom of the range for compared to their peers, there's probably some work proven and adjustments that can be made. But that's part of what we do.
Thank you.
So for the next slide,
Mr. Chairman, may I make a comment?
Mr. Shook, please.
If you go back to that slide, one of the other things I do want to point out here is that this range is for Telfer plans. If we actually plotted this against all the systems in the state, the comparison would be significantly less attractive. So I do think that comparing to peers is valuable, but at the same time, we know what the actuarial assumption is, and we know what the other peers are doing, but we also need to look at what the rest of the pension universe is doing. And these returns are very, very, very low compared to what is normal and customary and what has been experienced over the last several decades by pensions across the state and across the country. So I don't want to understate that there's a performance issue here that needs to be addressed and reconciled. So thank you.
Thank you for those comments. And I think that these returns have to be considered also in the context of the return assumption, 7.5%. It's pretty aggressive. Mr. Munter, please.
May I make a comment?
Ms. Dush.
Mr. Munter, you did, it was stated that the staff did work closely with Abilene, the fund, and the city. It is my understanding that they did change their investment consultant along the way here. And there was a lot of moving of assets or whatever. Could you talk a little bit about what you understand as being the changes that they made with respect to the change in their investment consultant?
We'll touch on a little bit more of that at the later slide, but just a brief overview here. The system did change their investment consultant in 2019, and they have been making a number of changes, which has helped and helped improve the system overall from what they were at before. Another thing just to consider that wasn't in our slides, but is in our overall review report, was that their investment expenses are very reasonable and below averages, so they are making sure that the investment expenses are reasonable. A lot of this is just coming down to a couple of investments that didn't necessarily perform that well, as potentially well, and over allocation to risk assets that might have impacted them quite significantly during this time period. But their new consultant has made some good changes for them. And I'll touch on a little bit more about what we're all seeing on our recommendations.
Thank you.
Thank you. Please.
So for this slide, this is just showing the discount rate for the system at Abilene versus Texas, as well as you have the national average. So what we see is that Abilene's discount rate has trailed the overall Texas average. And the average for Texas systems is a little bit below 7% right now. And then nationally, when we see it compared to other systems across the US, according to the NC survey in 2023, the average return assumption was 6.86%. And so this is just something that this is what we probably want to look into, and from what we understand from their actuary is that they are considering and looking at lowering the return assumption now to about 7.25, and then further looking to lower it in a couple of years down to 7%. So that is would be a welcome change in our opinion, and it's something that we would encourage them to consider looking into if not making those changes. And then for the next slide. So this is just covering the non-investment cash flow, and just as a real quick recap of the non-investment cash flow here for our viewers. The non-investment cash flow is simply just looking at the cash flow that the system is experiencing. So contributions and funding coming into the fund, and then investment expenses, benefit payments leaving the fund. So this doesn't look at anything from the investments impacting it. And this is a good metric to also consider because of how this cash flow can impact the funds. So a more mature system, which Abilene is, would have typically a normal range of about 1 to 3% negative investment cash flow, and that is a normal thing for a more mature pension. Now, as the non-investment cash flow becomes a bit more negative, though, that can be a sign of stress on the system's assets, and is something that should be considered. And we do see here that in the past, Abilene did have some pretty significant non-investment cash flows, and they are hanging around 4% right now. Now, the reason that this is something that is concerning is because as that non-negative investment cash flow does increase or is more negative, it means that more assets have to either be producing an income that has to leave, or assets have to be sold and potentially at not the best time in order for them to supplement and help pay for those benefits. And if a system right now, which is about 50% funded, was actually fully funded, this non-investment cash flow of -4% would actually be closer to -2%, right? So about the normal range. So the whole concern here is that this non-investment cash flow can put significant stress on the system. And this continues then with the next slide. Why we are ultimately making that a consideration for more conservative asset allocation and lowering those investment returns we discussed earlier would be something that should be considered by the plan. So, and to Marcy's point earlier in your question, so in 2019, this is when the system started making those changes with the investment consultant. And what we saw back in 2018 was that the system was taking on a relatively high amount of risk with their investments. This is including equities and alternatives, in real estate with a smaller portion to fixed income. And now the new consultant has made a number of changes, and they are doing a lot better and are close to target allocations that are similar to other self peers. But we do think that ultimately a more conservative approach might be needed for the system here, just considering their overall funding level and the non-investment cash flow. And with those changes to the lowering of the return assumption, a more conservative approach and investment allocation with a lot more taken if instead of targeting that higher 7.5%. And then that more conservative approach would ultimately help reduce that overall risk that we were talking about earlier, volatility. And especially for a system with such low funding, they might not really have in them an ability to absorb another shock to the market and another large decrease.
That's a question. Mr. Reeves, please.
And as part of our review, do we or how do we look at or test liquidity of the portfolio? I'm thinking back to the last slide, there's a cash flow issue. I see, and not making a value judgment on the investment decision that increased allocation to a real estate portfolio that could be publicly traded securities that are liquid, but still may be positions that you don't want to have to liquidate if that's not on your terms. So do we and how do we sort of test the liquidity needs of the asset base, whether it's appropriate for the circumstances?
Okay. So we do look at a couple of different pieces here for the liquidity of the investments. The non-investment cash flow is helpful to sort of get an idea on what is expected from the assets there. But we also do then look at the overall investment. So they do have a considerable amount in index funds or ETFs that are very easily tradable. So there is an ability there from a liquidity standpoint to free up cash if needed. So they're not overly allocated to something that's a liquid that's more private equity based. And they do have allocations to private equity, private real estate that are 10 to 20% or so for each of those. But they do have enough assets that are considered liquid enough that if they do need to sell them, they could do that.
Okay, thank you.
May I make a comment? May I?
Ms. Rush, please.
You know, again, I'm not an investment professional, but as an actuary, this is a situation where I would find an asset liability study to be of real importance, because you're looking at a stochastic projection, you know, for 10, 20 years, and it would really help understand what the liquidity risks, what the investment risks are for any particular asset allocation. And I would hope, even though this fund is less than $100 million, I would hope that they would consider doing an asset liability study, either with their actuary or with their investment consultant, or the two working together. I think it would be extremely valuable because of our concern about liquidity.
Thank you. Good point. And we'll ask the actuary, the consulting actuary for the fund that's coming up in a while about that as well. Thank you. Can we go back one slide, please? On that. It looks like 2021 was an outlier, 25% typical public pension fund returns to the whole portfolio. So 2022 was down. That figure is going to go lower, probably to 6%, give or take. And it looks, based on the trend, that that's what it's going to be. Which means if you've got a negative cash flow of -5% and your return is 7%, that means you grew your assets by 2%. Is that about right?
Yes, that would be correct.
Thank you. Please.
So, with that actually concludes my section here covering finding 3, and I will be turning back over to David B. for finding Mr. Street.
So the finding 4 is that the $90,000 benefit cap does not appear sustainable and increase intergenerational inequity. So with the standard final average pay formula, as the members' pay increases, their income replacement stays the same. With a flat dollar cap, as their pay increases, the income replacement decreases. So in this chart, on the left, we look at a 2021 average member. That average member is 40 years old, making $93,000, having worked 13 years of services. Based on the valuation assumptions for pay increases, that $93,000 would be expected to grow to roughly $200,000. That cap at $90,000 then represent 46% of salary replacement retirement. Then moving on to a 2021 new hire, that average new hire makes around $52,500, using the actual valuation assumptions that they use, which is averages out to an annual 6.9% increase. They would make over $300,000 by the time they retire. That works out to 28% salary increase. And in 2031 new hire with 2.5% inflation at 52,500 would grow 67,000. And using the average 6.9% pay increases, that's 67,200 would grow over 400,000. And then $90,000 stay the same, so then that salary replacement drops to 22%. We're looking at a 2041 new hire with a 2.5% inflation. They would start out at a salary of 86,000, and with the 6.9% average increases, they would end up over $500,000 less than retired. That $90,000 cap remains the same, so they would be down to 17% salary retirement. The point I would make that under the current methodology, if it's 2021, you have a 30-year amortization. Then that includes 10 years of 2041 new hires and beyond coming into the system and helping out that amortization period by overfunding for their own benefit to supplement their plans. The system has expressed that they want to increase the cap, but there's currently no plan in place to develop a contribution and benefit strategy. The last point I'd make is that even if a firefighter didn't put their lives on the line for the community, any employee who has 15% deducted from their pay deserves a dignified retirement that those 15% deductions bring. And 17% pay replacement doesn't cut it. That's currently what's being projected.
Thanks, Dr. Gusmo. I want to be sure all members understand what's happening here. The plan has got an unusual benefit feature that caps the benefit from the plan $90,000. Correct? That's correct. And it, right now it's fixed. Can one of you speak to what governance-wise would be required to eliminate that cap or what change? Does that require the city to fund legislature?
Well, it would likely require a combination of changes to contributions and benefits in all likelihood. So that would be the city would need to be involved in the changes to city contributions if the members vote on the sheet.
Okay. That would be required to facilitate it, but I'm just thinking legally, what would you require? Vern, do you know?
Yeah, according to South statute for benefit changes, first the actuary would have to agree with any changes that are proposed, and then they would bring the changes to a non-proposed, non-respect.
So those two things, the actuary and then the members. Correct. Thank you. Ms. Duff, did you have a question?
Yeah, or a comment. And I think David Fee stated it very well. This is the chart that shows you why the amortization or funding period remains at or about 30 years. Because, you know, as like I said, we already have a two-tiered benefit where people hired before 19 get one level of benefits and people hired after get a different. And then on top of that, you've got this $90,000 cap. So if you look at a current, a pre-19 member, his normal cost is probably, you know, something greater than 17%. And he's contributing 15. So he is getting something, you know, of a subsidy from the employer, from Abilene, as far as the value of his pension benefit. Somebody hired after 19, their normal cost might be below at or about 15%. So it would appear that they are contributing the full amount of the cost of their benefit. But down the road, somebody hired in 2041 would probably be, if they're assumed to contribute 15% of pay, their benefit might only be worth 8 or 10%. Meaning that the remainder of that contribution that they're making is going to fund the unfunded liability. And so, again, here, it's not really up to the PRB to determine whether or not employees should help fund the unfunded liability. This plan is in a pretty tough situation. But the question I have in my mind is, you know, should a current member maybe fund no part of the unfunded liability, but somebody hired 20 years from now be funding 7 or 8% of their pay to pay for the unfunded liability. You know, I think there has to be a discussion of, if the members are expected to contribute some amount toward the unfunded liability, should it change over the generation, or should they say, you know, you'll fund your normal cost plus 2% for the unfunded liability and the city will take the remainder? I think those are the kinds of discussions that are going to have to happen here. And those are difficult discussions because, again, the amount that employees are contributing already is very, very significant. And I just think this is a big issue.
Yeah, I think you've touched on part of the heart of the matter. You're exactly right. At a certain point, employees are going to be paying for a portion of benefits for somebody else, somebody who came for them. And it's going to become a recruitment and retention issue for the city.
Now, I have heard actuaries and I've heard others say, you know, it's not necessarily unfair to have current members pay for some of the unfunded liability since they perhaps were undercharged in prior years. But again, I think what you're seeing here is an extreme situation where, you know, somebody down the line, you know, is contributing, you know, twice as much, maybe not quite twice as much, but twice as much of what their own benefit is worth. And as you said, I think we'll discuss it later on, but what implications does that have as you know, from a human resources standpoint? You know, once members really understand what's happening here, how willing are they going to be to contribute 15+% of their pay for a benefit that's worth much less?
Right. Thank you. Other comments from the board right now? Okay, Mr. Fee.
So continuing with finding 4, we'll start talking about potential improvements to the projections incorporating the benefit cap. When the cap was first implemented, I believe around 2004 at $80,000. It was raised a few years later to $90,000, I believe around 2008. And initially it was used closed group amortization. So they only included current employees when they calculated that amortization. And so it was basically used those top 2 lines in the chart. So flat normal cost is 17% in all years, and 5 employee contributions 15% in all years. So you're constantly forecasting a reasonable spread between the 2. Now, normally when you have a second tier, you would have a second, you could think of it as another horizontal line for that's lower than this normal cost. So maybe current members would have a 17% normal cost and new members would have a 16% normal cost. So there would be a floor to how far the normal cost would drop over the period of the chart. But in this case, with this cap, there's no floor, and you can see that the normal cost just under the open amortization group just keeps dropping with no floor. There's no, it will just keep dropping over time. And so along with normally with those horizontal lines, you would have constant demographic assumptions are unchanged over the period. But the question that we'll go over in the next couple of slides is what is reasonable to assume for future demographic assumptions as that normal cost keeps going down, as that value benefits keeps decreasing in the future, but the member contributions keep being forecasted well above that much. So specifically, we're going to look at the pre-retirement termination assumptions. So the benefit cap causes value benefits to decrease each year in the future. So likely members will realize that their accumulated contributions are worth more than the benefit. Members would then reasonably request a refund of the contributions, those contributions being worth twice as much outside the system as they would be in it. Now, I've lived in Texas all my life, and I'm still learning Texas geography today, but I believe an Abilene firefighter could drive in under 40 minutes down to 20 it's a sweetheart. And so my contention would be, why would a firefighter remain in Abilene in this condition when they could just drive 40 minutes down the road west and work for Sweetwater or some other firefighter system with better condition. So this next slide shows the current expected termination rates. You can see, using the expected 46% salary replacement for current members, terminations are expected to be under 5% for any firefighter needed. And then as you move on to future hires at 28% salary replacement, same levels. Terminations expected at under 5%. And then again, with the 2041 new hires, a 17% salary replacement, and we see the demographics stay the same at under 5% a year. As a reminder, the 30-year amortization in 2021 would include 10 years of these 17% replacements below coming in over the 10-year periods. The systems actuary and I have discussed this. My contention is that any reasonable firefighter in the right-hand column would leave within, say, 3 years. So I would expect percentages of high as 33%. And as he points out, I can't say I've ever seen a firefighter pension plan with such high rates. So from his thinking, how can you fit in such, he can tell me if I'm misrepresenting, I believe his contention is that how can you put in such high rates of assumptions when we never actually seen a pension plan, firefighter pension plan with such high rates of pension. And so I believe that pensions do play a key role in firefighter retention, and that more would terminate as benefit drops. But really the key takeaway from my conversation with this actuary is that we're discussing how to reasonably project an unreasonable benefit. And the clear solution isn't to change how we're projecting an unreasonable benefit. The clear solution would be to change the benefit so that there's a reasonable projection of reasonable benefit.
Before you go on, I want to be sure everybody's on the same page here. The current expected termination rate is at 4.97%. What that means is that firefighters age 25, roughly 5% are expected to vote.
Correct, under 5%.
And that drops by half by age 35 and so forth. And then there is what you're illustrating in the table is that there will be no change. There's projected to be no change in that behavior as the value of the benefit effectively drops.
That's what's currently being modeled.
Thank you. Questions, comments, Marcia?
Yeah, again, I can't speak to every firefighter plan, but it is my impression that, you know, firefighters generally work from hire to retirement. Usually the plans have a 20-year vesting requirement, meaning they don't vest in their employer benefit, the annuity benefit, until they have 20 years of service. But if they leave, they get a refund of their contributions. Sometimes there's an interest credited on the contribution, sometimes there's not. It's my understanding that in this plan, if a firefighter leaves before retirement, they get a refund of their contributions without any additional interest. And again, remember, this is a plan where the firefighters don't belong to Social Security. So, you know, it does, to me, speak to the fact that, you know, a firefighter, you know, would want to stay if they believe they have an employer provided benefit at the 20-year, you know, mark. So I do think to me, this is, again, don't know all the details here, but if that, when the actuary is doing that assumption as far as what future normal costs are going to be in order to determine that funding period, if they're coming up with, you know, 7, 8, or 10% for those future hires, it is my understanding that they're using these termination rates to determine those normal costs in, you know, in the future, which then in fact drive the amount that that employee hired in the future is going to be contributing to the unfunded liability. So this I think is a very important assumption.
Thank you.
I was just pointing out that none of us can point to a firefighter system where members are actually contributing so much more than the benefits work as projected. So the best possible outcome would be to change this benefit, put in the plans to change this benefit, so that we can project benefits to try and understand what would actually happen. I don't think any of us want to see what we're having. If this were. 25, payroll growth and individual salary increase assumptions. When I look at both of these, they sound like they might be the same assumption, but they are very different. The individual salary increase assumption versus the expected growth each year of individual firefighters in those salary. So you're asking for the $93,000, are they going to be $97,000 next year, or are they $98,000 less? And generally, that decreases over the career. So you might have 11 or 12% salary increases in your first 3 years of employment, but as your employment continues for your later years, you might only get somewhere around 3%. The payroll growth assumption refers to the expected growth of the total system. So we're talking about net of retirements, net of new hires, net of everything. Is the total payroll expected to go from 17 million this year, 18 million next year, 19 million next year? What's the assumption? When you think about it, this basically combines individual salary increase expectation with also future headcount projections. So an increase in headcount supports the payroll growth assumption of inflation. So looking at the next slide here, we can see the payroll growth rate versus actual. And this system has done a very good job anticipating the payroll growth rate decreases before they occur. But for plan experience, the active firefighter count has increased from 167 to 192. The city demographics, according to the census, the city is growing. That growth has resulted in them needing to build a new fire station, which will ultimately lead to hiring more firefighters. So they are growing, and that growth supports payroll growth rate above inflation, which they are at. And like I said, they've done a good job anticipating payroll growth rate decreases in the past. But we are suggesting on other assumptions that they decrease them significantly. And this is one assumption that would also look reasonable, not just 3%, but also look reasonable for each quarter. The last thing we're looking at is an unusual spread with individual salary increases. So we'll go over this more on more slides. But the payroll growth assumption is 50 basis points above inflation, while the late career individual salary increase assumption is 250 basis points above inflation. And we'll talk about that relationship. So since both of these assumptions are loosely tied to inflation, most systems have either no spread or very little spread between payroll growth rate and the late career salary increase. So this chart shows the expected individual salary increases in the 21st year of employment and the expected payroll growth rate. And you see all but Odessa and Abilene, they're all basically identical or very, very close to each other. Abilene was an aberration, and I'll say that this actuary inherited the assumption from the previous actuary, and that the system has never been required to perform an experience study. Now, according to section 802.1014, if Abilene Fire was 100% funded, then an experience study would be required every so often. But because the system is only 50% funded, they are not required to perform experience studies. So based on this chart, we suggested they perform an experience study, and they did, and we'll go over the results of this.
Will you say again who is required to perform the experience study?
So it's systems 802.1014 says that Texas public pension systems with assets over $100 million have to perform the studies that we have.
So their assets are below 100 million, but liability above 100.
Right, and that's why I said if they were 100%, they would actually be required to perform these studies, but because they're not, they do not have 100 million assets.
And they have or have not performed an experience study today.
They were at our request. They did perform one while we were doing this analysis. We'll go over the results on this.
Okay, thank you.
So we do thank them for performing this. You can see the current assumption before the experience study on the left-hand column. Our salary increases start out at over 11% and decrease to around 5% from service for an averaging increase of 6.9%. When they did the study, they found out that the actual increases were lower for an average increase of 5%. And their proposed assumption is in between the two at an average increase of 5.9%. So the full 1% below for each year than the current assumption. So that's significant. So a $93,000 average salary would have been projected to be around $186,000 in the 27th year of employment, but now would only be $158,000. So this change in assumption should make it easier to find the solution that removes the cap. We do not have this incorporated in any of our projections or analysis, but that would be my expectation. So I would estimate that a 7% discount rate with these new assumptions, the tier 2 normal costs, even if they remove the cap, would only be around 14%. And they're currently scheduled, if I understand correctly, to possibly pay up to 17%. So that's something that we're used to.
Thank you.
Continuing to find crime, now we're looking at mortality improvements. So mortality improvement measures an increase likelihood from one year to the next, and numbers are even people every year. So you can see in the chart on the upper right, life expectancies for 65-year-old male have increased significantly over the years. So using the UP 1984 table, life expectancy for a 65-year-old male was 15 years. So that means that pension payments for that 65-year-old male would have been expected to continue for 15 years of time. Now using the PUBG 2010 table, that length of pension payments has grown by 32%, 15 to 20. So for that reason, many actuaries are incorporating mortality improvement assumptions, and this system is doing that as well. They're using a 5-year static assumption. So you can see in that chart below for a 25-year-old male firefighter, by the time they're 65, with no projection, with no projected improvements, you would still expect that 10 to 20 years using PUBG 2010. But with 5 years of improvements, you would expect it to go to 21 years. But using the generational approach, you'd expect them to get 24 years of payments. So it's really these young members where this assumption has
Mr. P, do you have a sense for the magnitude of the effects of the change in mortality improvements relative to change to salary increase assumptions rate negating one another?
We do not have the salary increases incorporated into our analysis, but I would encourage them to work with the actuary, the city, the members and the actuary work together based on the new assumptions and come up with a plan that equitably distributes contributions between tier 1 members, tier 2 members, and the city.
Thank you. So you just identified two particular assumptions that, if implemented, based on findings that experience study, one would improve the income condition, lower the cost, the other would be the opposite.
For the salary increases, it will depend on whether they keep that cap in place. So with the cap in place, the lower individual salary increase assumption would actually make the liability increase, the increase, because they're not changing the benefit that they receive, that you are lowering the amount of contributions. But if they remove the cap, then the salary increase assumption would make it look more favorable, because you're actually changing the projected benefit on cap to be lower than it was in the previous assumption. So that's why I said, I believe this lower salary increase assumption will only make it easier to find a palatable solution to remove that cap.
Thank you for clarifying.
David, this is Marcia Dush. I know that in corporate plans, I believe they're required to use generational mortality improvement in the legal evaluations. Is it common in public plans to use a static mortality improvement assumption?
No, the vast majority of our tests from the pension system use the generational.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. P, you have more now? Or is someone else?
We're going to move on to Mr. Burnham and finding 6.
Mr. Burnham.
Thank you. So finding 6 is the system lack certain good governance practices. And so planned governance has been an area of focus recently, and staff had identified specific areas we believe the system could excellent. The first major area pertains to the system's website. So we reviewed their website early on in the process, and we noticed that there were links to reports and other items that were either inaccessible or non-operational. For example, they have a page on their website which contains links to all their reports that they sent to the French Review Board. However, at the time when we first looked at the website, Links or reports such as PRB 1000, the investment return consumption report, would be non-operational, and a link to the financial audit brought us to an older audit that was from 2017 rather than a more current audit like 2021 audit, which we started at the time. We had been in discussions with the system throughout our review process, and when we informed them about this finding, the system did quickly make strides to address this issue, and they are now showcasing their most recent report. So while that was an issue when we first started, that issue has started to be addressed by them. And another area of focus was with MET reporting, or minimum education training program reporting. All plans are required to update the pension review board of trustee and administrator changes within 30 days of those changes taking place. Early on in the review process, it was discovered that we only had 6 out of 7 trustees being reported to the pension review board. And we know that there's 7 because health statute designates very specific requirements for what health report. And so our records for the system were clearly out of date since we only had 6 out of 7. So on top of that, only 3 out of the 6 in our records were compliant with their minimum training requirements. But this was another area that we had discussed with the system during the process of review. They have been quick to address these issues, provide us with updated records to ensure that the trustees are getting the training that is required of. Currently, all 7 trustees are registered with the pension board. 2 of them are still not compliant with their continuing education training, but all trustees have satisfied the core requirement. And even those 2 that are non-compliant still with the continuing education training have reported some training, well, some requirements, they just haven't gotten all done. Thank you. That concludes.
Could I ask a question? It would be really interesting. I hope that as you were having these discussions about compliance, did they give you some feedback as to what the barriers they feel are to compliance? I think that would be very helpful for the review of the MET requirements that is going to be undertaken shortly. Any feedback on why it's so difficult to keep up with the reporting requirements?
I think that's something that maybe can be better answered by the plan when we have the opportunity to talk with them. So I don't have anything in my head right now that to satisfy that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. That concludes our findings, and we'd like to move on now to our recommendations. And for our recommendations, I'll turn it back over to David.
So recommendation 1 is to consider adjusting benefits and increasing contributions. So on this slide, we show a lot of the things we looked at as possibilities. These are just suggested possibilities, and we encourage the system and the city and actuary to work together to come up with options in the own network. But the ones we looked at include removing the $90,000 cap, applying tier 2 formula to tier 1 members, increasing city contributions from 21.25 to 24.75. Looked at a couple of return scenarios, using generational mortality, and a couple of payroll scenarios. So on the next slide, this top line was one example of a plan that would provide a dignified level of benefits with a reasonable distribution of contributions between the city and the tier 1 and tier 2 members. And as again, I just point out that this did not incorporate the proposed changes from the system. So you can see in the legend that top line includes removing the cap, 7% expected returns, 3.25% payroll growth rate, applying the tier 2 formula going forward to tier 1 members, and the new city contribution system. Now the system did respond, and they said they do plan to move to the 7% expected returns over the next 4 years or so. They plan on increasing the city contributions by 1.75% over the next 2 years. And they also plan on increasing member contributions by 1.75%. They did not respond with any benefit changes other than contributions. If those increased member contributions do include tier 2 members, I would encourage them to reconsider I would also encourage them to reconsider a 1-for-1 increase between the city and the members. I believe previous slides we show that there's possibly more room for the city to come up than the members, so a 1-for-1 exchange may not be the best solution. But in the end, I would just encourage the system, the city, and the actuary to work together to find that benefit and contribution level that works for all parties under those rules.
David, this is Marcia again. Again, to me, this all goes back to, at this point, there has to be a discussion of what is the responsibility of the members, the current members, future members, to fund the unfunded liability. And I think, you know, irregardless of what your benefit level is, what is the responsibility? And then, you know, and then you can look at what the city can fund. And, you know, again, I think it's going to take, you know, like I said, very hard decisions here in order to get this fund, you know, get the funded ratio for the fund up. I would also really encourage the fund to think about if they really believe that the 7% return in working with their asset consultant in doing maybe an asset liability assumption using trying to determine what their asset allocation should be. If they really believe that 7% is the appropriate return, then I would suggest that any work they do with respect to determining benefit levels and contributions be done using that 7% return in order to really understand the costs and not defer costs into the future.
Thank you, Marcia. I know there's a lot of moving parts here, but if I remember correctly, you indicated that employees are staying on the 2% of the total cost of the plan, which 2% for the plan as a whole. Is that roughly correct?
Yes, and of course it's different for tier 1 and tier 2 members. For tier 2 members, it's likely they're paying all or more than what the current benefits.
So an increase of 1 3/4% or so, the employee cost is just going to increase the portion of the basic benefit the employees are paying already.
Yes, and they may find it necessary to do that for the tier 1 members, but it's really the tier 2 members I would strongly encourage them to reconsider, because it's going to the point where they're paying more.
They're paying the full cost of benefit.
More.
Thank you. Okay, is that all for recommendation 1 for now?
Yes, we'll move on to Mr. Munter.
Mr. Munn.
All right, thank you. So for recommendations 2 and 3, this is covering first one for recommendation 2 of conducting a regular asset liability study. As Arja, you've mentioned a number of times now, and we do agree that an asset liability study is something that should be considered by the system. And this is something that normally can be conducted every 3 to 5 years, or during periods of changes, which at this time we think let's do that. And ultimately, the system should work with their advisor to consider if that lower 7% return or 7.25 would be a more appropriate assumption, as well as what that would do to impact the fund's asset allocation, and more importantly, how that could potentially look to make it a more conservative allocation that reduces that volatility that we talked about earlier. And then for recommendation 3, we would recommend that the system look to improve the transparency by updating their investment policy to reflect the actual asset allocation. So in their investment policy, they do allow for a more flexible approach because of their private investments. If they're not able to fund those or to invest in those investments, they're allowed to invest in domestic equity. And we would recommend that those asset allocations, the actual targets, be put in the investment policy statements, or something that was done by them in the past on their website. They would actually publish their quarterly reports, but have since stopped. We would recommend that potentially be started out as an alternative to post their quarterly reports as the reports that they do provide, which was part of the information that provided to us. They are very informative and would be something that's helpful for members and other stakeholders to have. So we would recommend one of those two things done. Then with that, that covers recommendations 2 and 3, and I'll turn it back over to Dave for 4 and 5.
Any questions on those members? On to recommendations 4 and 5.
So for recommendation 4, we're looking at that $90,000 benefit cap, talked about so much. The best solution would be to remove the cap entirely from the plan provisions. Other options would include indexing the cap to increase with inflation. And the third option would be to amend the cap to be 11% of compensation rather than a $5. So you could say that members will never get more than 55% of pay rather than $90,000. And then the second, the fifth recommendation is to use an experience study to inform changes to assumptions. So as we stated, they already formed an experience study that was received after we completed our analysis. So we encourage you to go ahead and refine that individual salary increase assumption as proposed. Look at the generational account improvement assumption. And then we'd also encourage them, based on how impactful this experience study was, to consider routine experience studies.
David, let me make one more comment here. Experience studies are very helpful and can be, they are one of the considerations when you're setting demographic assumptions. But especially when you're doing projections, you have to take into consideration what is to be expected down the line. And I think one of the things that we talked about here was, experience study, the past experience is really most applicable to what's been happening primarily with people hired before 2019. And so when setting the demographic assumptions into the future, you really have to consider what changes do you expect for the people hired after 19, especially as that $90,000 cap hits. And again, we talked about it's really hard to figure out how to set those demographic assumptions because we haven't seen a plan like this, well, we've seen plans with the $90,000 cap, but we've had the same issues that we don't have experience to know whether people will up and leave because the benefit is disproportionate to the contributions. And so so experience studies are extremely helpful, but when you're doing funding projections, in order to do the funding period in this situation, you really have to consider what's going to happen down the line. And I think that takes a lot of discussion between the actuary and the city and the fund.
Good point. Thank you. Anything else on recommendations 4 and 5? Okay, on to 6. Mr. Vernon.
Recommendation 6 is to conduct a voluntary funding sinus restoration plan, or VFSRP, and update their current funding policy. So while the system is not currently at risk of triggering an FSRP based on their most recent evaluation, that can change depending on what steps they're taking to address their funding issues, as well as change based on the new triggers that are set to take effect in 2025. So typically, Abilene's funding ratio of 49% would trigger an FSRP after September 1st, 2023, if their end period were to rise to even just 31 years. We recommend the system consider conducting a voluntary FSRP and update their current funding policy in tandem with the city. Now, a voluntary FSRP would likely include many of the changes Abilene is going to be undertaking in an effort to reach full funding. So one major advantage of performing a voluntary FSRP rather than waiting and possibly triggering one after 2025 is the revived FSRP exemption that the voluntary FSRP might grant under specific conditions. And so a revised FSRP has a maximum allowable funding period of 25 years instead of the standard 30 years. And the revised FSRP also requires an ADC structure and automatic risk sharing mechanisms. At least one of those risk sharing mechanisms must be a deductible benefit or contribution. And so completing the voluntary XRP before September 1st, 2025 has the potential to exempt them from those stricter requirements and give them more freedom of the type of change that they want.
Thank you. This is a product of that legislation passed a year and a half ago, and intended to create an incentive for people to do it sooner rather than later. Right. Questions on recommendation 6, members? On to 7, please.
So recommendation 7 is improve the use of website to increase transparency and facilitate stakeholder engagement and communication. All of our public retirement systems are required by statute to post the most recent reports submitted to the Pension Review Board on a publicly available website. Since the plan has a website of their own, it should be used to fulfill this requirement. And during the course of the review, the system has already been yes and adhered to this recommendation. Beyond just hosting most recent reports, though, the website can also be an extremely helpful tool in communicating with informed plan members. Potential items the system may wish to include on their website could be things like providing important dates such as their board meetings. Mr. Munter suggested earlier that this system could provide their quarterly investment returns reports so that the members can stay informed and up to date on how the plan assets are being managed. They provide other key things like community events, pension news, and other resources that can be developed. The system commented, the system's comments that they gave to the review and should be attached within the packet had mentioned that they currently utilize the website for voting on plan changes, trustee voting, as well as including a feature to help calculate their benefits. And we believe that those are great inclusions, and we just want to provide other ideas that could help communication.
Thank you. Questions, comments on recommendation 7, members? On to 8.
All right, and last but certainly not least, staff recommends that the board of trustees should utilize the pension reward courses or other approved resources to become compliant with any requirements and remain compliant moving forward. Some of the most popular trainings available utilized by TALFA trustees typically are the PRB online courses, which we have links to in this presentation if you access these slides online. The TechSurge conferences, and of course the upcoming TALFA conference, which is going to be held October 1st to 3rd for students. Training can also be received from any of our other accredited sponsors, a listing of which is available on our website, or can be received from non-accredited entities, but those must be approved by the Pension Review Board, and they get approved on a case-by-case basis based on the applications and information that we receive. As I noted earlier, the system had begun addressing NP compliance, but it still has a few trustees who require some additional hours, and it's important to remain on top of trends moving forward as well in all trustee departments.
Thank you. Comments, questions on that or any of the recommendations? Ms. Dutch.
Again, I apologize for being on a soapbox here, but as I've mentioned in previous board meetings, you know, for an employee who's contributing 15% of their pay, 15.2% of their pay into this plan, I sure want the people who are managing my money to be responsible and take it seriously, and by complying with the minimum education requirements, I think is a demonstration of taking it seriously. And if they don't, I think that the membership ought to have the information to know, you know, the next time they come to vote for board members, and they ought to know how well the board members are doing with respect to managing their money versus, you know, recognized benchmarks. Again, I think this is extremely important. And as I said, I'm looking at it from a member's perspective. You could look at it from a taxpayer's perspective as well, but from a member's perspective, they're contributing 15% of their pay into this plan. And that's a very substantial reduction to their take-home pay.
Thank you. Appreciate your comments. Other
Mr.
comments? Mr. Gonzalez, please.
Yes, thank you. I completely agree with Mrs. Dush's comments, and maybe take it a step further. David Fee, you and your team put together a great presentation here with very reasonable recommendations that I could get behind. My question and then a comment. Question is, most of these recommendations, while some are technical, to me seem like typical best practices that any fiduciary board of trustees for a pension plan like this ought to have in place on a regular basis and be talking about annually during their meetings. So I'm a bit surprised, that it would come to this level to hear these types of recommendations, like a typical 3 to 5 year ALM study or a 3 to 5 year experience study, or completing your educational requirements. Things like these to me seem like fiduciary responsibilities that are standard best practices and shouldn't have to be told or reminded to do these things. So a bigger picture question that I have is from that same position. From a fiduciary responsibility, it seems to me that there's a disconnect between the governance of some of these plans that we've been hearing about the last couple of years since I've been on this board and the actions that they take. And I have concerns that we started in 2001 at a 71% funded ratio, and 20 years have passed by and it's only gotten worse. And this is, barely coming to this committee for discussion. This is not a PRB issue. It's a broader problem. And I think it relates back to corporate governance and best practices that fiduciaries may or may not be taking into account. And part of it is my observation, the trajectory of options that some of these boards have, with the lack of knowledge that they may have in understanding of valuations and how these things impact the funded status and contributions and payroll, et cetera, is pretty wide. So a wide trajectory of options. So it's a comment, but it's also sort of a broader question. Is there a way to bring this in line moving forward so that we are in front of these things rather than behind them as we are today?
That's a pretty big question. And some of that is philosophical. I could not agree with you more, Mr. Gonzalez, on your observations, that none of this is new, and it is striking that it has been allowed to go on so long, and that is not to indict anybody, the individual or institution. I think we have a governance issue. It's not specific to this plan. It is embedded in statute and in culture and in rules, and it's an issue that really needs to be addressed, perhaps in part by this board, but also by the legislature and also the system plans of the state. I appreciate your thoughts. Ms. Josh.
One of the thoughts that I've had as I've reviewed this and the previous intensive review for Wichita Falls is, in fact, that the law does not specify how the funding period or amortization period is to be determined. And as we've seen in this situation, the reason that the amortization period has been able to keep under 30 years is because the actuary has been projecting that members will continue to contribute 15%, even though their own benefit is worth 8 or 10%. And so, one of the things I would bring up is that perhaps there needs to be guidance or some sort of change with respect to how the funding period is determined.
Yeah, I think that's a point well taken, and my hope and expectation is that before the next legislative session, this board will have a discussion of these issues and possible recommendations we might be able to make to adjust statutes to address that. I also want to echo a comment Mr. Gonzalez made and staff for the work on this pension review. I think it's an incredible piece of work. I would strongly recommend that everybody associated with the pension plan say the Texas read it. The issues and recommendations in that report extend well beyond Abilene and really affect every pension plan. So, and the level of knowledge and expertise that went into this report is incredible. I hope that you all will read it. And with that, before we hear from the city representatives, I'd like to ask that we've been going 90 minutes now. Let's take a 15-minute break. We'll be back here in 15 minutes. Thank you. Okay, thank you for that, Ray. We are now back in session. And still on the review of the Abilene Farmers Relief and Retirement Fund. We appreciate everyone's expertise, forbearance, patience as we work through this. This is all very valuable, I think, hopefully to everyone who's here. Next, I'd like to call representatives from the city of Abilene and the Abilene Fire Pension Fund together for the city. Mr. Robert Hanna, City Manager. Mike Rain, City Finance Director, who's also Abilene's Fire Secretary and Treasurer. From the Abilene Fire Pension Fund, Mr. Roger Goodman, Plan Administrator. Tony Kay from Anco Consulting. Lindsay Redmond, Graham Heinrichs, and Taylor Walling from Foster and Foster from Florida, if I'm not mistaken. Could you all please take a seat at the table? I'd like to ask first representatives of the city of Abilene to provide any prepared remarks you might have, and you could introduce yourself before you begin speaking. Good morning. My name is Robert Hanna. I'm the city manager of the city of Abilene. The first thing I want to do is thank our representative Stan Lambert for formally requesting this process. I know it's unusual for a plan in the city to say, hey, please take a look at this. But this presentation that was received just confirmed the reason why I think we need to go through this process. So I next want to thank the commission for staff members of the board for allowing us to have this opportunity to make this as a healthy exercise. It's one that puts fun gauntlet and provides analysis and insight that we may not agree with every dot till in the report. We certainly understand there are concerns fund that need to be addressed. This provides a blueprint and a roadmap for us to address perhaps further begin to make a sound moving forward. I want to commit to the board and to the fire pension fund members, the city manager, or the city council to implement strategies, contributions, city side that will help secure the actual citizens. I think we need to have some pretty focused conversations on equitable distribution of benefits as well. So it's been brought up in the essence of time. We can't go back in time and fix assumed rates of return or actual rates of return. We have said about all that all we want to, but we're what we have. Hope doesn't fix this. Get it up and down. And make some tough decisions to make sure that the firefighters who have spent their years serving our community with their lives have a benefit pension system that they can rely upon. Thank you. Is there anyone else from the city, not the fund, but actually the city who wishes to defeat the board right now? Okay, we appreciate your comments, and we, on behalf of the board and the PRB staff, I want to stress our appreciation for your very cooperative attitude, and Mr. Lambert, Representative Lambert's willingness to participate in this as well. Thanks very much. I'm sure that we all will be working together coming months, and we appreciate all of that. Thank you. Is there someone from the pension fund who wishes to provide?
Rodney Goodman, Plan Administrator. I do not have prepared remarks, but some of the findings I will address. This is Ms. Josh, as far as her MET questions, things like that. Why we have trouble with some of that, but we have several trustees that do not travel to Texburg to talk to conferences, and I failed to keep track of that. We've got a new spreadsheet and process now that we can track
NET and state time on that, so they're working on getting their two remaining members to work with it current. And we'll keep that, I'll keep track of that in the future, and keep that up there as well. And as well as the website too, we'll add our quarterly reports on there and make sure that stays updated also. Thank you, Mr. Goodman. We appreciate the work you've done so far in response to the PRB's communications. Thanks for coming down to us. Next, we have representatives from Foster and Foster, the consulting actuary, to the Abilene Fund. And Mr. Heinrichs, welcome to Texas.
Thank you. Good morning. Actually, it's afternoon now. Thanks for having us. I'm Brad Heinrichs, Foster and Foster, linked by Lindsay Redden, Taylor Walling, my colleagues. So we get free actuaries. So maybe free actuaries better than one. Anyway, I wanted to make just a few comments, and I'm sure there'll be some questions for us that I'd like to answer. But first of all, I'll just say that I thought that David and Marcia did a nice job, a balanced job, of really laying out the issues, especially in Marcia's opening remarks. I thought she did a good job of really kind of laying the groundwork, the framework for the situation that exists. One of the things that I wanted to comment on might help Mr. Reese with one of your questions earlier about the deteriorating funded ratio with the amortization period staying somewhat the same. One of the reasons why the funded ratio has deteriorated, in addition, of course, to investment performance not being up to the standard or the expectation, is just that over the last 10 years, we've been working for 6 of those. But over that time period, the actual assumptions have become more conservative. And so when you're thinking about a fund ratio, a normal person says, well, whatever funded ratio was 10 years ago versus now, that's an apples to apples comparison. But if you go back 10 years ago, you'll know that the assumed rate of return was 8%, not 7.5%. So that made the fund look better funded than it would have been if we were using 7.5%. The payroll growth rate is 5%. It's really not been 5%. Payroll growth will, if you think about paying off an amortization period over a period of time, you're taking the payroll, you're growing it at 5% a year. And remember, there's an amount of money that's going to pay off the unfunded liability that is a percentage of pay. If I'm assuming that payroll is going to grow at 5% each year, then the amount that's going to be paying off our debt, our unfunded liability, it's growing quite a bit over that time. And so that was a very aggressive assumption back then. It's now 3%. The salary increase assumption was 5% flat. Everybody's going to get a 5% increase. I think David, I remember his remarks, his discussion, it was closer to 7%, what we're assuming now. And so when the mortality table has gotten more conservative over time. So when you're looking at 10 years ago versus now, it's not quite the apples to apples comparison that you might intuitively think. So when you're becoming more conservative in your assumptions, it's very difficult to improve your funded ratio along the way, unless you are increasing your contributions, which are not fixed. So that's certainly played into this dynamic. A couple of other comments, and I will be quiet. I think that it's very fair to say, I think Marcia mentioned this and Dave as well, that the normal cost, the cost of all of the active firefighters earning a year of service, the employees are paying a high percentage of that share, probably a higher percentage of that share than what you'll see in other telco funds, and certainly if you left Texas and went across the country to other public safety funds. That's just really a fact. The members are contributing their fair share, or probably more than their fair share, relatively speaking, compared to other plans. And I think that they're right in suggesting that with this cap, and it's a second tier, that the normal cost is going to be for each of these members is going to go down. They're still contributing their, whatever it is, 15 ish percent. And so, that is a dynamic that I would imagine would be prevalent. With that said, it's not the only reason why someone becomes a firefighter pension. It's not the only reason that they'll stay. I don't know that it's necessarily certain that turnover rates will increase for tier 2 members versus tier 1 members in the future. Either way, we do experience studies every 5 years, and if that shows to be the case, we'll change the assumptions as we go. I will say that I think that it is important that when you have a multi-tiered benefit structure, which exists here, where tier 1 members have a certain level of benefits, tier 2 members have a lower level of benefits, that when you are determining the amortization period, you must do an open projection, where you are assuming that when a tier 1 member retires or leaves, they're replaced by a tier 2 member with a lower benefit structure, which is a lower normal cost. I think that just resembles reality. I'll also say though the same thing, that when you have a $90,000 cap, I think there were some overtures or some thoughts about how it would be nice if that wasn't there. I'm sure the firefighters would agree that they would love to not have that cap there. That $90,000 cap brings the cost down. In fact, we looked at potentially indexing that cap, say with inflation. That increased the normal cost almost 4% of payroll. So if we wanted to remove the cap or index the cap over time, someone's going to have to contribute an extra 4% of pay just to take care of that issue and keep everything the way that it is. So that's a pretty substantial cost. Would I personally love for it to not be there? Well, sure, and I'm sure the firefighter agrees, but it's going to cost money. That's a surprise. The last thing I'll say with regards to the cap is that regardless of whether or not we think that it might be altered or removed in the future, as the actuary, we have no choice but to value the liabilities in accordance with the plan as it's written. We can't presuppose or presume that eventually at one point in time in the future that $90,000 cap's going to go away. It's in the plan. Tell the members vote to change it, it's going to be there. Now, when or if they do vote to change to remove the cap or index the cap, then we'll make changes. But I don't think that it's appropriate according to actual standards of practice to be projecting changes in benefits levels when you are calculating liabilities or for this purpose amortization periods. So that's just an aside that I think has some relevance. Talk about, you guys have anything to add, or did I steal all your thunder? I guess not. So with that, I'll answer or entertain any questions, comments. Hopefully I addressed a lot of the items that the board members addressed in there.
Thank you, Mr. Lyman. We appreciate you making the trip up. Appreciate your remarks. Members of the board, we have everybody here. City, representatives of the city, the fund, and the consulting actuary. Are there questions, comments for any of these individuals? Discussion.
Just a couple of comments. First of all, I have a concern that if this is a very circular process. I know that as the actuary, they cannot approve a benefit improvement if it is not sustainable by the fund. So yes, trying to approve, removing the cap or whatever at this point in time without other things changing would probably be impossible by Foster and Foster. But my concern is that down the road, if you do improve the cap, either by indexing or removing it, at that point, like you said, you increase the normal cost by 4% or some amount at that point, but you also increase the liability for current members. and not necessarily retirees, because you're not necessarily going to change their benefits, but for active members, you would also increase the liability, which means that would increase the unfunded at that point in time. And that would have to be funded by either future members or current members into the future, in addition to the normal costs. So deferring a change like this means pushing even more money out to the future. So that's one concern. But again, you know, when you're 49% funded, it's hard to improve any benefits. The other thing I can say is, yeah, I agree that you value the plan as it's written, but then I go to the assumptions, and maybe this is where I'm struggling with the valuation, which is it reasonable to assume that when you're doing a projection, is it reasonable to assume that future employees, future firefighters, you know, when their benefits worth 8%, will continue to contribute 15? You know, again, 15 is what, you know, 15.2 is what's there. But again, when doing a projection, is that an assumption, you know, that those employees will be willing to contribute at 15.2? And then that goes to, you know, David's concerns about the other demographic assumptions about what the behavior will be at that point in time. And yes, you said you can continue to do periodic experience reviews, but that's backward looking. The question is, and again, you know, David made the point, how do we understand the behavior? Is it reasonable to assume that behavior would be similar to what prior behavior is with respect to retirement or termination or anything else? And again, very difficult to determine that. And a lot of it will depend on, you know, competitive opportunities. What is Sweetwater providing? What is some other fire department providing in the neighborhood? So again, I have concerns about projecting that future employees are going to be willing to contribute 15.2 or I think it was 1.5% potentially in addition, or 1.75% in addition to 15.2. So just those are my concerns.
Thank you, Ms. Josh. Mr. Heinrichs.
They're fair concerns. But again, you know, what history do we have, even looking at other plans across the country where members are contributing 100% to the normal costs? You don't see that a lot. And so you know, it's speculative to see what's going to happen to termination rates. I will say this, for all of the public safety plans we work for across the country, and there's probably a few hundred of those at least, for firefighters, turnover rates are really low, and it doesn't matter what the benefits are. Firefighters tend to, when they're hired and they get through the rigors of fire school and whatnot, and they're entrenched, they stay until retirement. And so it would be more unprecedented to start to see bigger turnover, like large turnover rates for the tier 2 group, than it would if they're to say that they're going to stay relatively flat, because that's what you see across the country in terms of just turnover in fire departments. And so again, it feels to me like you know, what you're going to see is we're going to do experience studies every 5 years, and if you're right and turnover rates are, say, they're double what we thought before, we'll pivot and make adjustments. But I think it's almost unprecedented what we're looking at here. And if one actuary can suggest one thing and the other one can speculate another, but nobody can actually look to, okay, this is what the same thing has happened over here, and we can look at that and use that as our model to you know, to go by.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Zook, please.
Thank you. So I haven't made a lot of comments yet because of the fact that I really wanted to hear from the city and the plan and the actuary before I made my comments. So, well, the first thing I want to say is that staff, this is some of the best work I've ever seen since I've been on the board. So congratulations on doing a really, really good job of evaluating an extraordinarily complex situation. Number two, I do want to thank the city and the plan and the actuary for all the work that y'all have done. My understanding is that y'all have been some of the most cooperative folks that we've ever worked with when talking about an intensive review. So thank you. That goes a long way. The thing that I want to take and really shine a light on, going back to Marcia's comments earlier, is, this is a situation to where we need to step back and see the forest, because there's so many dang trees here. What we can say definitively is that this plan is not in great shape. The people that have been putting money into this plan are, really not getting what they hoped for. And I agree with the statement earlier that we can't fix what's done in the past. All we can do is focus on going forward. But what I can say is that we have so many assumptions in here that are based off of things that we most likely are going to see change and be inaccurate. We've got aggressive assumptions on actuarial returns, performance returns. We haven't achieved those. We've got a negative cash position. At the same time, we've got, interest rates have come up a little bit, which is good from the standpoint of this particular plan, not great for the equities in the portfolio. But, oh, by the way, 80% of the portfolio is in risk assets. So, we got literally a kind of danged if you do and danged if you don't. What I think, and particularly about this subject about, the future behavior and what may or may not change, I can agree with both sides of this discussion, because the fact that we know realistically this is going to be a problem, but as an actuary, they probably can't make assumptions about what assumptions might be made in the future. And so what I want to make sure is clear to the city and to the plan and to the members of this community is that this is not going to get fixed by any market appreciation, by any, change in demographics. People are going to live longer. We know that to be true, barring some real surprise. And there's absolutely no use for anyone to try to say that this is going to be an easy fix. If y'all don't roll up your sleeves and do something fairly dramatic, like we did in Houston, like has recently been done in several other cities, this is going to become a train wreck that everybody's going to watch happen and go, why didn't we do something in 2023? This is a problem. And this is about as big a problem as I've ever seen in my experience of pensions, not because of anybody's wrong behavior, but because of the fact that just simply the numbers don't work. And so I just cannot implore y'all enough. Don't sit on this. Don't sleep on this. Tackle it. Get the taxpayers involved. Get the city council involved. And come to a table and figure out, okay, what do we have to do to really fix this thing permanently, not just kick the can down the road.
Thank you, Mr. Zook. Excellent comments. We all heard you. Mr. Hannah?
Thank you, board members. I just want to double down on a couple of things. One, I think the backward casting look at the investment returns in a large part of why the funds in the health condition that it is. But I want to stress the fact that the city of Abilene and the council of Abilene, the council members are seriously committed to addressing the health of this fund. They have a strong belief that firefighters earn the benefit, and that benefit should be paid. The question is not, are we going to do it? The question is, how do we need to do it? And we have to partner with pension fund board members to get that done. And the conversations I've had with the pension board members they've been positive and they've been cooperative today. One of the reasons why the city has suggested that the employees contribute additional dollars is because of the political reality of you've got 10+ years of woefully underperforming investments that have hurt this plan significantly. It's not the only reason, but certainly it's been a large contributor to it. And the city council had no control over that, or nothing to do with that. One of the things I would encourage the pension review board to look at is, Mr. Chairman, you mentioned that we're gonna examine things to recommend legislation next session. There ought to be some sort of nexus for the PRB to have a little more teeth than they do. And maybe even there's requirements that are put forth by the legislature for all these plans. Just make sure that you have to have these minimum requirements. If they're too low now, maybe they need to come up. You all know more about this than I do, but I do think that a little more teeth help. We're committed to fix this. We're committed to work trying to do it, recognizing that there are basically two levers we can push, but we control benefits, contributions. We will have discussions about using both of those levers.
Thank you for those remarks. I was remiss in my introductions, not recognizing Tony Kay, who is with ANCO, the Funds Investment Consultant. Welcome, Mr. Kay. And you're relatively new to the fund. And if you have any observations about changes that you've made since you got there, and changes you see forthcoming, I think we'd all be interested.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate that. Certainly appreciate the analysis of the Abilene Fire Pension Plan. Dr. Staff produced a fair report. As you mentioned, we are newer to the plan as a vendor. We began working with the plan in 2019. Some of the changes that we have made have included exiting performance or underperforming assets. We have strived to lower the costs of the investments. I think that was mentioned in staff's earlier remarks. We are currently in the midst of an asset liability study. We expect to present that in November or December. Anticipation is that obviously, as you've heard today, we will have discussions around the current discount rate and looking at lowering that and the impact that might have on the asset side of the equation. Fortunately, we're in a higher interest rate environment, good for investors, not necessarily for borrowers, but that's certainly something that we will be looking at and discussing with the board as a possibility to capture some of what the market is supporting us, read into that in line with the comments heard earlier about an opportunity to take a more conservative approach, potentially and lower some of the risk of the portfolio. Last comments that I will make, liquidity came up. That is something that we monitor quite closely. I know that alternatives gets a broad brush and a broad definition. I can assure you that when we have worked over the last couple of years, although we have committed additional assets to alternatives, the majority of those have been income-focused alternatives. So where you're getting some type of a quarterly distribution. So not all alternatives are necessarily risky. And not all bonds are necessarily safe, as we saw in the market returns in 2022. So happy to address the questions and additional comments.
Thank you for coming out and remarks. Before I move on to some other issues, questions for Mr. Kay, the investment consultant, right now. I'd like to see what kind of agreement we have on certain issues here. I think that there's an obvious consensus that there's a problem. And maybe drilling down on that, there seems to be a consensus that maybe 7.5%, that's the return substance high. Does anybody object to that? Might be better off with 7 rather than 7.5%. About the $90,000 cap issue, is there a consensus that ideally that would go away? Does anybody object to that?
Originally, when that was put in, the idea was to index it or do away with it. And since it was put in, we've not been able to index it up, but that was the original idea to not have it.
Is that to say that you believe that $90,000 ideally would go away?
Yes.
Or at least be increased?
At least increased with inflation, index up, something to that effect. The plan never was to keep that indefinite.
Okay. I assume that everyone here has seen the recommendations that made by the PRB staff. Is there any overarching or philosophical disagreement with those recommendations that we should discuss?
Mr. Chairman, if I may, this is Christopher.
Mr. Doug, please.
So one of the things that I would encourage the group as you evaluate all the various choices to consider is a shared risk model, similar to what Wisconsin uses, similar to what we did in Houston, where those benefits have the ability to flex up or down based on the performance of the assets. You know, I heard what was said about the taxpayer sensitivity, and I totally agree with that. One of the things that you could consider as you discuss changing the benefit cap is to be able to give the beneficiaries a significant upside in the event that there is upside, but also, you know, to share in the discomfort if the investment returns are not, you know, are not strong. So obviously too deep for this conversation today, but I'm happy to share in the future and be helpful any way I can. That was a way that we got a lot of different constituencies all on the same page, was by being willing to share, you know, share the feast together, and to a certain extent, to a reasonable extent, share the famine together as well.
A lot of opportunities to learn from around. So there's generally consensus that the PRB staff recommendations are sound, and that those are objectives worth working toward. Is there anything that's going in? Josh, please.
I would like to go back to an earlier comment that I made, which is I really think that one of the first discussions has to be about who is going to pay for the unfunded, who's going to pay for the unfunded liability for benefits which have been accrued in the past. And, you know, to that, with a special focus on pre-2019 hires, post-2019 hires, you know, to what extent should a member be required to pay both for their, you know, to what percentage of their benefits should they be required to pay, and what is their responsibility as far as paying for benefits accrued in past years? The unfunded liability is very large. As you said, there are political ramifications to how you increase contributions, whatever. But I think there has to be a fundamental decision on what, you know, current and future members' responsibilities are. And I don't think that they should be all shoved, you know, to fund the liability in an increasing way into the future for future hires. So I would just encourage you to have a philosophical discussion as to what you're willing to live with respect to membership contributions. And then from there, you have to build your alternatives with respect to benefit design and city contributions.
Thank you for those thoughtful remarks, Ms. Josh. As Mr. Hanna alluded to, we are the pension review board. We're not the pension fourth board. We can't make anybody do it. We can shine a light. We can provide expertise. We can help. We can't do it. And ultimately, these are policy issues that have to be determined by the city, fund, and plan members. And we're here to help. That's all ultimately. For the good of the order, any other comments, questions for this group we have in front of us? Going once, twice. Thank you again for coming to Austin. We appreciate your time. And please let us know how we can. Thank you so much. Okay, members, I will entertain a motion to adopt the Abilene Fireman's Relief Retirement Fund Intensive Review as presented. Unless anybody has suggested amendments to that.
Marcia Dush moves for adoption.
Chris Gonzalez, second.
Ms. Dush moves, Mr. Gonzalez, Mr. Reese beat you to it. 3 seconds. Is there discussion? Hearing none, I'll call for the vote. All those in favor of the motion, please say aye.
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 Those opposed, say nay. Motion passes. Review is adopted. Thank you very much again, staff, for all of your work on this. And that is the end of that agenda item. We are on to an actuarial committee item. I'd like to ask Ms. Aaronstein, our counsel, to present item 6A.
Morning members, Mayor Aaronstein, General Counsel, presenting on items. We just provide an update on independent actuary selection for the Dallas Police Fire Pension System. Next slide, please. I presented some background on this requirement at the June board meeting. As a reminder, the PRB is statutorily required to select an actuary for the Dallas Police Fire Pension System, or DPFP. And this actuary is tasked with developing recommendations to improve the system's funding period to 30 years or less. I'll also note that the system recently triggered the Funding Soundness Restoration Plan, or FSRP, requirement, and is required to submit an FSRP by September 1, 2025. After the June board meeting, the PRB selection committee, made up of 2 staff members and 1 board member, reviewed and scored 2 proposals and developed a recommendation for selection. David P. and I presented this recommendation to the PRB actuarial committee at its July 27th meeting, and the PRB formally selected Chiron to serve as actuary and provided a letter signed by Chair Lively and Ms. Cardenas to that effect. The system and Chiron entered into a contract in August. Next slide. I'll talk now about the process and next steps going forward. Chiron has begun their work and is currently analyzing the 2022 actuarial evaluation to develop recommendations. These recommendations are anticipated to be presented to the DPFP board on November 9th. Then Chiron will complete the second phase of work, which is analyzing and developing recommendations based on the 2023 AV. This is the statutory required review and is estimated to be completed in January or February 2024, and then presented to the systems board, which is tentatively planned for February 2024. The system must then adopt a plan that considers Chiron's recommendations and falls below the FSRP trigger. The PRB will work with the system and Chiron to determine appropriate times to provide status updates at PRB board or committee meetings. And finally, the PRB is required to submit a report to the legislature on this process by December 1, 2024, before the 89th legislative session. The report must include a copy of Chiron's analysis and a summary of the system's rules that are adopted as a result. That concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much, members. This is an information item only. We're not taking action. Are there questions, comments? We'll be hearing about this more in the coming months. We good? Seeing none, let's move on, please, to item 7, notice of intent to review rules. Ms. Aaronstein.
Mayor Aaronstein, item 7, notice of intent to review rules. I'll touch briefly on the general requirement for agencies to review rules, the rules proposed for review, and the process and timeline. So first, the rule review requirement. State law requires state agencies to review each of its rules every 4 years. Agencies must determine whether the reasons for initially adopting the rule continue to exist, and then must adopt with amendments, or repeal each rule as part of the rule review. The rule review process generally follows the statutory requirements for any other rulemaking, including providing opportunity for public comment. Any rule amendments or repeals identified through the rule review process must be published in the Texas Register. Next slide. Staff recommends proposing 6 chapters of PRB rules for review. This is all chapters except for the Funding Soundness Restoration Plan, or FSRP rules, which were adopted in 2022 and therefore do not yet need to be reviewed. The number and subject matter of each chapter is proposed for review is included on the current slide and also has those chapters. Next slide. I'll turn next to the rule review process and timeline. The first step in rule review is to publish notice of intent to review rules. If the board so moves, we'll publish the notice in the Texas Register after this meeting, and this kicks off a 30-day public comment period. Staff will also conduct a review of each rule concurrently with that comment period, and based on public comment and staff review, staff will develop a recommended action for the rules to present to the board at the first meeting in 2024. I do want to point out that we anticipate the need for more substantial amendments to the minimum educational training program or NEC rules, and possibly to the investment expense reporting rules. Staff have identified some potential rule changes in the course of administering these programs, and we would like to get informal input from stakeholders in addition to the formal comment period in order to ensure that the rules are workable for stakeholders as well as the agency. So we expect a longer timeline for these rules to ensure sufficient time to get input from the board, the appropriate board committees, so education committee for the NEC rules, the investment committee for the investment expense reporting rules, and of course stakeholders. Staff plans to present to the board at the November meeting with more information on potential changes and the plan for review on those two rules. And so those two rules will be on a different time frame than the other chapters we reviewed. So we expect that the proposed amendments will be brought to the board in mid-2024, and then the rules for adoption in fall 2024. That concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to answer.
Thank you, members. We are slated for action on this item. Are there questions about this? This is a requirement by state law. Seeing no questions, I would entertain a motion to publish a notice of intent to review the rules contained under Title 40 of the Texas Administrative Code, Chapter 601, 603, 604, 605, 607, and 609 in the Texas Register.
So moved.
Moved by Mr. Reese. Is there a second? State law requires us to do this. Can we get a second?
Marcia Duff seconds.
Ms. Duff seconds. Is there discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed say nay. The motion passes unanimously. Thank you. Thank you, Tamara. Next item on the agenda is the report from our esteemed Executive Director, Amy Cardona. Ms. Cardona.
Thank you. Members, item 8 is the Executive Director's report, and this time it's just the updated fiscal year 2024 operating budget. It's essentially the same operating budget we adopted in June, because we're not yet through the first month of the new fiscal year. It appears the same, so we haven't actually closed out the month. But we typically include this as part of our board packets for these bylaws. It's really not just all. And that concludes the executive report.
Thank you. This item is future meetings, agenda items, dates, locations, other arrangements. The next board meeting will take place November 21st, 10 a.m. with an investment committee meeting following afterward. Both meetings will take place at this same location. And if there is no further business and no objection, I move to adjourn this meeting.
I second.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.